On behalf of the organizing committee, I warmly welcome you to the national level 1 week faculty development program on criticism in English literature, organized by A.C.T Academy, Tamil Nadu and Kerala in collaboration with the Constituent College of CVM University, Gujarat. Dear participants, it is our pleasure to introduce Dr. Sonali Pattnaik ma'am, a multifaceted personality who has made significant contribution to the world of literature, education and art. As an award-winning poet, academic, educator and visual artist, Dr. Sonali ma'am has left an indelible mark on the literary scene. Her poetry collection, When the Flowers Begin to Speak, had been hailed as a milestone in Indian feminist literature and has been featured in prestigious journals such as the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. With over 20 years of experience in teaching literature in English, Sonali ma'am is a renowned academic and educator. She has published several book chapters with prominent publishers and is waiting to the release of her book on gender and Bollywood cinema. Her achievements have been recognized with numerous awards, including the Orange Flower Award for Poetry, Gifted Poet Award, the Panorama International Youth Literature Award, the International Excellence Award, and the WE Trailer Blazer Poet Teacher Award. We are honored to have Dr. Sonali Pattnaik ma'am with us today and look forward to her valuable contribution. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Pleasure being here. Thank you so much, Dr. Vasanthi. Thank you, to ILSASS for having me here and to A.C.T Academy to be able to speak to all of you wonderful faculty members on a topic that I have taught for long and is also very close to my heart, both romantic criticism as well as Victorian criticism. So what I'm going to do is I'm mostly somebody who uses speaking as a method of discourse. And I will share, of course, a presentation as well, some slides. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mostly speak about some very important texts that really mark the period that we come to know as romantic criticism and Victorian criticism. So the texts I'm going to cover and the authors I'm going to cover are William Wordsworth, obviously, because the preface to Lyrical Ballads, the Lyrical Ballads, as you know, was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Wordsworth together, a beautiful collection of poetry and writing, which we will also minimally touch upon. But the preface is terribly important because it is seen as the manifesto to romantic criticism. In a way, it decided and paved the way for what was to be seen as criticism, literary criticism, at the time, as well as for the years to come after. But it was also, in a sense, a socio-political treatise. So it's very important that we look at this text and how it affects romantic criticism positively and critically. The second text that I'm going to look at is Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, a very, very exciting text and equally important, coming a little after the preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Why this is also important is because the way in which it is also a multi-genre kind of text. So this becomes also very important, not for understanding literary criticism at that time, which in a way transcended the boundaries of one particular discipline and sort of leaped into several disciplines. That in a way is the history of literary criticism, where today we have very strict disciplines sometimes, of course, and I'm speaking as an academic and a poet and a critic. So in a way, I don't respect those boundaries, and many critics and poets and writers do the same. But somehow we have come to create those boundaries. So it's very interesting to see how in the Romantic age those boundaries did not really exist when we talked about literary criticism, and what are really the consequences in a way of writing like that. So Coleridge's Biographia Literaria is a perfect text to look at those generic aspects as formal aspects, as well as, like William Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, the political, social, and aesthetic aspects of both those texts come together, right? They will then move on to the idea that women are very rarely considered. It's only in the last decade or so that women critics and writers have been started to be included in what we understand as Romantic criticism as well as Victorian criticism. So I'm going to look at that gap, and what I'm arguing, of course, with several feminist critics who have already done this, to say that several women critics have been left out, and it's also our duty and responsibility as writers and educators to be able to introduce some of those critics into our syllabus as well as to our students. So I will marginally look at Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of a Woman, which is not a typical Romantic criticism text, but has been argued, and as I will be also arguing, is extremely important because of the way in which it influenced not just Wordsworth and Coleridge and others, but the way forward for Romantic criticism as well, you know, and also draws upon several figures that both Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey, Robert Southey, so many other Romantic critics also draw from. Then we move on to Victorian criticism, and I will look at Matthew Arnold's, obviously, because that is seen again as one of those quintessential definitive texts as far as Victorian literature goes. Culture and Anarchy. And the titles itself, you will see, are very revelatory in terms of the shifts that have taken. You know, from nature, we have come to culture, and we have come from freedom from Romantic criticism, which I will speak of shortly, to anarchy, or the fear of anarchy. So Arnold's Culture and Anarchy becomes a terribly important text, right? And extremely important one for understanding Victorian criticism and the way it was shaped. And then we finally end with some, again, many figures who I will not be able to touch upon entirely, but I will mention them, many women critics as well, and other male critics who we don't see because we hear so much of Matthew Arnold. And then finally the Art for Art's Sake movement, which has in a way made a complete turn from Romantic criticism to Victorian criticism in terms of going from political and social aesthetics to a very individualistic and a very guarded kind of aesthetics, where art is now, we are told, not to be for social responsibility or political change and reform and so on, but only for its sake. And that we will see also affected 20th century literature and so on, as many of you would know. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope it will be visible. And please let me know if it isn't. Right. Okay. So we begin with the first text that I'm speaking about. I hope this is visible.
Yes, it is.
No. Thank you. So this is William Wordsworth. Just a few biographical details, of course, not very important, but still to give you a context, because this is also the age, by the way, Romantic criticism also created that idea that studying text within a context also becomes important, both historical and political context. William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, is the author of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads. The preface was, ironically and interestingly, written in the second volume of the, when the second volume of Lyrical Ballads was to be published. This is also a very, very important factor to understand why and how, because of the reception of lyrical ballads. This was such an experimental piece of work at the time. Why? Because neoclassicism in literature, the mock heroic style, neoclassical style, the Greek and Latin, the language as well as the aesthetics of that period, of the classical period, was precisely what was shaping the 18th century at the time, the literary forum, as it were, the literary arena. So for Wordsworth and several others after him and around him to come in and to write in a style that was defiantly different from the neoclassical and mock heroic style, as well as in theme to be extremely different from that, obviously created a lot of, heartburn and, a sort of lot of questioning. So in a way, Wordsworth was writing to defend the lyrical ballads, its style, and the fact that it was a kind of experimentation. So he plays it down. But what is very interesting, when we read the preface, and I'm only going to touch on a few points, but I will urge all of us to read it, those of us who haven't, and would love to hear questions about that. The preface is also a very unique text, because it's not just about literature and aesthetics. He is, in a way, talking about social and political change here. This is not surprising, because as we know that the Wordsworth we know today, before he went to France, before the French Revolution, was not the same Wordsworth. But once he went there and he, trekked through the Swiss Alps and he trekked through all of France, he lived there, he fell in love, he had a daughter. Unfortunately, he had to leave them and come away when the revolution got very bloody. And then he spent the rest of his life, as we know, with his sister Dorothy, who worked with him for some of his greatest works, which came, like the Prelude, which came much later in life. That is the Wordsworth we know. But the influence was from this time, from the French Revolution. And being influenced by the revolution, the revolutionary in him, really comes out in the preface. So it's very interesting that it is not just about aesthetics, but aesthetics and criticism is linked to socio-political change. So what are the things, this is some of the facts, of course, where he was born and the fact that he was called a lake poet because he lived in the Lake District, and a lot of his writing also, a lot of his criticism, or what you would call literary criticism, was about also defending, it was activism in a way. It was also defending the beauty of the Lake District. He did that both in his poetry as well as in his acts, and as well as in his critical writing, to defend natural beauty and also to prevent industrialization from taking over that district and that arena. So it's beautiful how Wordsworth epitomizes the way in which a poet, and his poetry come together with his political and social sensibilities, and that also finds an outlet in the life he leads, his practice, and in the literary criticism that he shapes. So this is, Wordsworth and where he lived and so on. Now, I just want to pause here and talk about the fact that, there are three very, very important ideas that I want to speak of in the preface. Yes, it revolutionized British poetics. Why do I say that it revolutionized? Because it brought in a very strong democratic spirit to the idea of British aesthetics and poetics. What was Wordsworth saying? He's saying that we no longer need to write poetry that is high-handed, that is florid, that is purple. So, and in shifting the language, he's also democratizing it. He's saying that the language of poetry, and in his criticism also he's changing the language of criticism, the language of poetry no longer has to be or should not be, this is the claim that the preface is making, should not be extremely florid. It doesn't have to be very majestic, very florid. It has to be what Wordsworth and Coleridge both call the common language, the language of the people. So you can see how beautifully democratic this idea is. Today, those of you who are familiar with really good poetry in India, there is particularly that is written in local languages, which I have been familiar thanks to the other channel of my work. There is something of the resonance of what the Romantic poets were calling for through their criticism, which is to go back to the language that belongs to the people. That is the poetry that really touches hearts and souls and so on. So there are both political and personal reasons, as you can see in Romantic poetry and in what Wordsworth is asking for, the change that he's asking for. The other aspect is not just the language, but it is mined by and reflected in what he's calling for in terms of the thematic changes. So he's asking for the fact that we no longer write about the rich, we no longer write about the landed gentry, which was the style at the time. If you remember Dryden and others, the other neoclassical poets, right, and the poets, the dramatists before them, and so on, and Congreve and others. It's always about aristocracy, right? With the preface, what Wordsworth is calling for is a stop, a halt to that, to stop writing for the privileged and the powerful, or for the aristocracy and for the royalty, and to write for the people. This is directly influenced by the French Revolution, which is asking for equality and fraternity and so on, right? So liberty, equality, fraternity. If you look at the three words in the anthem of the French Revolution, and you can read the preface in tandem with it, you'll actually see that this is exactly the kind of ideas of thematic richness of Romantic criticism as far as Wordsworth is concerned. Coleridge also echoes many of these. Free ourselves from our past, free ourselves from this kind of constricting uppity language, as it were, and write the language of the people and about the people. So he centralizes ordinary human experience, right? So experience becomes a very important fact for Romantic criticism. Okay, so till then, I don't think most of the writing, if you look at it, before Romantics came in and the criticism came in, there's very little that speaks of human experience as being important. So in a way, this is extremely revolutionary as far as the critical landscape is concerned. For the first time, you have a phenomenological idea coming into aesthetics, where what we experience as human beings, we must write about. The preface defends that and celebrates that. Very famously, if you remember, he says that Coleridge, it was decided, would write about extraordinary things, but he would make extraordinary things appear ordinary. Right, so his work was, his task, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's, according to Wordsworth, was to make the extraordinary appear ordinary. And Wordsworth's own task was to make the ordinary exalted appear extraordinary, right? So this kind of tussle, or I would say, not even paradox, the two ends of our human experience, the ordinary and the extraordinary, is what comes into to form the aesthetics that is at the heart of the defense of the lyrical ballads. Now, I want to read these two quotes. There are so many beautiful quotes in the preface, just to take a little time and think about what they're saying. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. This is one of the most common and most famous quotations, of course, of the preface of lyrical ballads. As a poet, it speaks to me directly, and as an educator, as someone who has taught Romantic literature, I think it's very emblematic of what they were doing with the criticism, and in terms of what they were, the aesthetics they were going for. So no longer do we speak about, exalted topics and politics and so on, or sovereignty and so on. Now we have come, thanks to the revolution, to a place of democracy where individualism takes center stage. Individual feeling, and every human being, every man as it were, or every woman, right? It's another matter that Wordsworth does not speak of every woman so much, but we will come to that. But the idea is that every individual, right, becomes important, not just the sovereign, as was in the periods before the Romantic age. It is not just the sovereign that has an individual identity or that has authority. Every individual now has authority. So the poetry must also then give accordance and give prestige and give authority to what an individual feels and does. Hence the idea of writing from that point of view of individual experience and feelings. They speak a lot, of course, about the importance of emotions and feelings, right, in the preface, as well as Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, which returns to the idea of feelings over and over again. Why? Again, it is to go away from the idea of the intellect and move to the terrain of emotion. What I think is terribly exciting here is that you actually see, in a way, the birth of what we probably call affect theory. Right? Today, as you know, in literary theory, affect theory is a very, very powerful and important way of looking at texts. Right? Martha Nussbaum is one of the singular figures of affect theory, one of the important figures, and she talks about how we have made a mistake in constantly looking at texts devoid of emotion and feeling and so on. We have to look at feelings of writers, characters, and so on. In the field of cinema, similarly, analyzing through affect means looking at the emotions involved, not simply narrative, plot, character, and so on, right? So affect theory, I would think, in a way, the germinal seeds are here for us to see in powerful feelings, of course, recollected in tranquility. The tranquility and solitude aspect also comes in a lot in the criticism of both Coleridge and Wordsworth. This again has its roots in their human experiences as well, where they were both partly to the revolution, but also once the revolution got too bloody, right, and too difficult, a lot of the British poets and writers at that time would need to move away and carve out the importance of a non-violent space. So solitude and tranquility becomes very important there. They were also deeply influenced, let's not forget, by the work of Edmund Burke, along with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talks about nature, right, as being, that's the second most important aspect, by the way, of course, nature as being the space in which a writer really revives herself or himself, the space where literature should come from. That's obviously terribly important. So that is what Rousseau, of course, brought into being, and why, again, has a political reason, because nature is contrasted with culture, with the city, right, with everything that is bound in a way, which stands for bondage, which stands for chains and so on. Whereas in nature, right, symbolically and philosophically, all human beings are free, right? So philosophically, that is the charge, and that is the origin or provenance of the use of nature in romantic criticism and poetry. And that's why the preface, as well as the Biographia Literaria, exalt the idea of nature. This is a very beautiful line, because again, other than nature and the fact of feelings and so on, we also, not just affect theory, we also see the emergence of the idea of corporeal or bodily experience when it comes to writing literature in romantic criticism. The body, as you know, with the Enlightenment and so on, particularly the Cartesian idea was, dubito cogito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I think I am, and that led to this, excessive heightening of the idea of reason and rationality and the intellect, even with the neoclassicals. And this was, romantic criticism was directly, in a way, responding to neoclassicism. There is a need to come away from the intellectual space into the body, and to say that it is body and what it feels that we need to speak about and write about in literature, right? So I chose these 4 lines because they beautifully reflect that idea, that shift. The eye, it cannot choose but see. We cannot bid the ear be still. Our bodies feel wherever they be, against or with our will. Very beautiful idea that the body always feels, so you cannot ignore the body. Now, another thing that they're, of course, responding to here, and Coleridge says this very much in Biographia Literaria, is the formal education that a lot of writers were put through. And particularly in Biographia Literaria, there is an exposition of the impact, the terrible or drastic, and damaging impact of formal education at the time, British formal education and even European formal education, on the artist and the writer and so on. This is a very interesting and exciting area which I think is not theorized enough and does need to be looked at. What is the connection between the idea of the revolution, between political change, democratization, the idea of nature, human experience, the body and writing, and education? Today, with the NEP and so many changes coming in with homeschooling and so on, with people looking at an alternative education, people looking at education differently, I think romantic criticism, actually the way in which particularly Coleridge and Wordsworth speak about it, play a huge role in rethinking the role of education and its relationship to aesthetics and writing. So these are some of the key concepts. I'm just going to read them out. We've already discussed them. The revelatory and revolutionary power of nature. This is what Wordsworth and Coleridge are both talking about, but especially what the preface talks about. The richness of human imagination. Again, the imagination, as you know, both with Coleridge and with Wordsworth, became a very important criteria as far as literary criticism is concerned. Again, very, very powerful. Why are they doing it? Because the imagination is something that allows you to move away from your assigned class and role in society. Imagination, in a way, consecrates and in a way authorizes every individual to be a significant figure, right? So in that sense, it's a very democratic idea. It was, again, deeply influenced by Edmund Burke's notion of the sublime, because the imagination will allow the writer, and obviously the critic also, but the writer, the poet, to in a way move beyond the chains of political and social experience into a higher realm. And that's, of course, what the role of literature was, according to the Romantic poets, to move from the ordinary into a higher realm, into the sublime. Sublime is critical to their work. The idea of humanity, very, very, very important again, and the shift from not just human essence and human connectivity, which you see so beautifully delineated in the lyrical ballads, but also move away from high life to rural or rustic life. We know from Terry Eagleton and others who've written about the country and the city why this was important for Romantic critics. The city, obviously, was the place of a lot of oppression. Industrialization was rising. There was urbanization. There was a lack of peace. There were diseases coming in and so on. It was, in a way, the beginning of the dystopia that we will later see in the 19th century as far as the city is concerned, and you'll see that in Dickens's works and so on. Already the Romantics are, and the Romantic criticism in a way is anticipating that and to talk about elevating and aggrandizing and centralizing, in a way, focalizing rustic life and rural life. Return to the forest, return to the countryside and so on. Of course, as critics, we need to understand that here too there is a certain kind of objectification of rustic and rural life, because if we are to look at the way in which rustic and rural life was organized, it was also not free from political oppression and so on at that time. There was obviously a feudal arrangement and so on, and the landlord, for instance, Fielding does this beautifully, shows you how much of what we call the bounty of rustic and rural life was only for the elite to enjoy. There is poetry, in Tom Jones and some of the other texts in Fielding, which shows that how, in a way, nature was seen as something there for the taking for a lot of people who belonged to the privileged classes, and literature somehow reflected that, right? So that is also something to keep in mind, that in a way there was an objectification of, or producing nature as a certain product of the imagination was also not free from its political biases and so on, right? So let's not forget about that. Now, importance of using common language, of course, in poetry is very, very important. We've already spoken about that. Why? Because, again, the revolutionary zeal in their preface, in the Similarly, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, quickly give you the biographical details. He's the author of Biographia Literaria, born in Devon, England. Like Wordsworth, was also considered one of the Lake poets. And this was important for me to put out there. The second edition of Biographia Literaria, I don't know how many know this, was actually taken out by his daughter, who was also a very brilliant critic and writer, Sarah Coleridge, right? Many a times my work involves pointing to the fact that when we look at the literary canon and we look at Romantic and Victorian criticism, as I said earlier, we often see the erasure of women critics. But the truth is, as with Dorothy Wordsworth and her collaboration with Wordsworth, and we now know that a lot of Tintern Abbey and so many other poems were actually written by Dorothy, and Wordsworth, in a way, worked with that material and was published under his name. Similarly, Sarah Coleridge, unlike Dorothy, is not an obscure figure, an important one. And it's important for us to talk about, her collaboration with Coleridge here, and how she, in a way, kept alive the legacy of her father and was intrinsic in the chain of Romantic criticism, in the genealogy of Romantic criticism, because she published the second edition and contributed to the fame of her father in a way. This is from Biographia Literaria, a beautiful quote. Again, if we can pause here and think about what Coleridge is saying. Coleridge is again revolting against the mock heroic style, neoclassical style, the Greek and the Latin that they are taught, and why we should not write like that. And passions, it become more important, right? So as a poet, I can completely relate to this also. Our faulty elder poets sacrifice the passion and passionate flow of poetry to the subtleties of intellect and to the starts of wit, says Coleridge, right? So intellect and wit, as important as they may be, now the literary criticism of the Romantics and their writing is revolting against both, revolting against reason, rationality, intellect, wit, because it's taking away from emotions, right? That's why I said you see the beginning of affect theory in a way. Passion becomes terribly important. So you see the democratization, because intellect and wit, as you would know, is obviously taught to the elite classes. But passion, as they also delineate, can belong to anybody. So anyone in that sense can become a poet. Of course, that did not happen. And in a way, Coleridge and Wordsworth are also writing from a privileged position. But the point is that at least they are using their privileges excuse me, they're using their privileges to argue for, those who are underprivileged and argue for the populace in general. And this is another beautiful quote from the Biographia Literaria, where Coleridge says, for poetry, and both of them obviously defending poetry here, no profession on earth which requires an attention so early. So this is beautiful, that the poet is born very early. Right? So again, rejecting formal education, rejecting everything that neoclassicism stood for, or neoclassical tutelage stood for, where you would give, students again and again several exercises in learning Latin and Greek and those styles so much, as Biographia Literaria talks about and delineates so much, that in a way they've forgotten what their own emotions and passions are like, right? But if the poet is somebody whose career begins very early, you have to let them out in nature, as it were. This is something that a precursor of Wordsworth, who I will end with actually also, known as Joanna Baillie, a Scottish poet, right, whose discourses, introductory discourses, the introductory discourse also talks about the same thing. She says, and very few people discuss her, but again, now a well-known figure, well enough known figure, is a precursor to the preface, the lyrical ballads, right, also speaks about this, that how she was not a very dedicated student and spent most of her time in the Scottish countryside. And that's where much of her poetry and drama, which she would go on to write and claim a lot of fame through her life, actually came from, right? So you have these similar ideas throughout all of this nature and in human emotions and passions and bodily experience and the interconnectedness of human beings and nature and the virtue and merit of that poetry. And within the political and social sphere, we know exactly why they are saying this, as Rousseau is, and so on. Right. So these are the key ideas, of course. In Coleridge talks about the imagination at much more length, and he also gives it a more technical, if I may call it, aspect than Wordsworth. He has for you the primary imagination, the secondary imagination, as well as fancy. As you know, fancy for Coleridge is a slightly lesser virtue in a way, something that is more ordinary, whereas primary imagination, which is how you receive and perceive the world, and secondary imagination, which echoes that, but also arranges it, organizes it, dissolves and diffuses it, and so on, is an extremely important faculty as far as the poet is concerned. So the distinction between fancy and imagination and the importance of primary imagination and secondary imagination in poetry, again, the significance of human experience, centrality of human passions, and again, defending his earlier style, which was not very austere, which was quite ornamental. Coleridge says, I understand now that that is not the best way in which to write poetry. That poetry should actually reflect, again, the common language of the people and so on. So you see how dramatically revolutionary their criticism is and what they are doing in terms of freeing up both imagination as well as the hand of the writer and the poet, and the relationship between criticism and political freedom and imagination is also extremely important here. Let's not forget, England is also in the midst of throes of creating its national identity. And while this is happening, it is also starting to become a political power elsewhere, right? And so when you come to somebody like Matthew Arnold, it is not surprising, because England is now a colonial power. It is an empire. It is no longer restricted to Britain, anymore. It now is starting to worry about the idea of too much freedom. So we have what I would say, unfortunately, in a sense, a lot of, in Carlyle and Ruskin and Arnold and so on, many of the Victorian critics, in a way, a return. Not all of them. There's John Stuart Mill and so many others who were also writing for social reform and the perils of industrialization and the perils of empire on public everywhere and so on. But many of the literary critics, and Arnold especially, you can see move away from the Romantic poets and move away from the idea of nature and freedom and fraternity and equality and common people to creating a class of people that are not so common anymore, that are much more privileged, educated, that know the best of culture, that know the best of thought, and so on. So it's not surprising that Arnold was laid with the charge of elitism, right? But that we'll come to. This figure, my favorite in this entire presentation, of course, although I think there's something to take from all of them, Mary Wollstonecraft. This is unfortunate that when we talk about Romantic criticism, we do not speak of Wollstonecraft, who was a very, very significant figure. In fact, her spouse later in life, William Godwin. Godwin was actually somebody who influenced both Wordsworth and Coleridge and several other writers that we now define as Romantic critics. So also influenced by Godwin, and also influencer to Godwin's work. This was Mary Wollstonecraft. Both Wordsworth and Coleridge were also influenced by her writing, right? 1792, the book that I'm looking at here, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I don't know if you can see me, but I also have a copy here. A beautiful, powerful text that was also very important in shaping what we know as Romantic criticism. why this is very exciting is also to show that no one thing, whether we talk about Victorian or Romantic criticism, is a monolith. Nothing is homogeneous, right? So just like I pointed out earlier with Victorian criticism, also you had these different prongs. You had the whole need for shaping culture against anarchy and so on with Arnold and Ruskin and Carlyle. You also had John Stuart Mill and others writing about the freedom and writing for reform, from industrialization and so on, fighting for those who are oppressed by industrialization as well as the empire, and writing for women. Again, Mill would owe a lot to Mary Wollstonecraft. And you have then the final stages, which is the art for art's sake, which is saying we don't want art should have nothing, sadly, to do with politics and social responsibility and so on. Right here too, with Romantic criticism, you see several different prongs. It's not one homogeneous idea, as we are often, let's say, sold by, more, let's say, more like sort of this key answers and notes and so on. So it's so important as educators to sort of involve ourselves deeper in the philosophy, the multiple philosophies of the time. So Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797, had a very interesting life, right? Is the mother of the incredibly brilliant Mary Shelley and Frances Imlay. Mary Shelley of Frankenstein fame, married to Godwin, was born in London, England, and deep influencer of. So I'm just going to read these important quotes and talk about what she contributed. So many quotable quotes from her brilliant text, highly recommended to read. My own sex, she says, I hope, talking to other women, I hope will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. Right? So she is making a case for women's education and women's emancipation. This book is called one of the first, or if not the first, feminist texts as far as European or British history is concerned. And not surprisingly, that she may write with a certain amount of tongue-in-cheekness, and obviously she had to survive at the time, making some pleas to the men around her, the intellect around her, but also this scathing criticism of how we talk about freedom and we talk about revolution and so on, but women remain unrevolutionized. They remain within bondages and chains. In fact, she categorically named several writers, among whom Rousseau is one. And those of us who know Rousseau, for instance, when Rousseau says, and Wordsworth was so deeply influenced by Rousseau, as all the Romantics were, including Wollstonecraft. When Rousseau says that, that nature is the space, as opposed to the city. In nature, everyone is free, and so on, is making a claim for, non-sovereign, or the sovereignty of all individuals, let's say, and a claim for democratizing. He is also speaking about, if you remember, Emile, the character, right? In Rousseau's Emile, he's a young boy. This is like in an experimental text. Rousseau says that Emile grows up in the forest, and in the forest he grows up free, right? But Emile's partner, the girl child that Rousseau mentions, does not have the same kind of freedom that Emile has, and a lot like Milton's Eve then has to follow and learn from Emile. So Wollstonecraft very intelligently and in a nuanced manner points out to the fact that this freedom that we are speaking of, both in literature and politics and criticism, does not extend to women. So she makes a plea for that. And this is very important to Romantic criticism also, because she has written not just this, several other critical texts which make these, not just these demands, but also show you the discriminatory nature and the hypocrisies also therein. The education of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, says Wollstonecraft, yet they are still reckoned, women she's talking about, still reckoned a frivolous sex and ridiculed or pitied by writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. Again, being very tongue-in-cheek, because William Blake, again, an important figure for Romantic criticism as well as Romantic writing, let's not forget, in fact, called Wollstonecraft, if I remember correctly, a hyena in petticoats, right? So it's very important when we teach that criticism, we include these dissenting voices and this other aspect of criticism. You may go through the concepts delineated here. The important one, of course, other than progress and freedom for women in the romantic criticism that comes from Wollstonecraft and many like her, is also dramatically different from what Wordsworth and Southey and Coleridge are asking for. She says that reason is terribly important. And so you see the same thing that is oppressive for men writing at the time and for natural reason, for good reason, is actually seen as important to women because women were left out of the system, right? They were denied participation politically and in the educational system and occupationally and otherwise, for the same reason that, you know, Wordsworth and Coleridge are asking for reason, but because of the lack of reason, women are left out, right? Women were seen as unreasonable creatures and only emotional creatures. So for her, this romantic critic, it becomes important to retain the importance of reason and say that no reasonable society would leave women out, and that women too are creatures of reason, not of emotion and passions alone. So the very thing that Coleridge is highlighting, passion, she says, no, that's not important. It is reason that is important, rationality that is important, and that's how women must take their rightful place in society. Also revolutionary like them, but the virtues and ideals that she speaks of are so different in constructing the idea of humanity as well as women's identity. Now we come to for the Victorian age. We have very quickly an overview. As I said, because of colonization, there's a lot of anthropological texts that have come in. In fact, one of the texts that while Matthew Arnold was also writing this very important text, Edward B. Tyler's Primitive Culture was also published around the same time, 1871, so, very similar to Culture and Anarchy, which was published 1869 finally, but as periodical essays from 1867 to 1868, right? Now, what is Arnold saying? A lot of changes have come in anthropological texts because of England's foray into the rest of the world, right? Because of the empire and because of the ability of ethnographers and anthropologists to get information about other peoples, tribes, and so on, and that's coming into influence discourse and criticism in England. There is also, because of the rise of the empire and English people, you know, foraying out into shores that were otherwise unheard of and so on. And as we know, the East India Company now has come into trouble, let's say in India, for instance, and this was happening in Africa and elsewhere also. But just to focus on the East India Company, Edmund Burke, who was also very influential in the Romantic critical period, has already had spoken about something called political morality. There is a lot of charcha, there is a lot of discussion and discourse in English Parliament and so on now about not just the ill effects of revolutions and bloody revolutions, but also of colonization on the English mind, right? And how it is important for England now to consolidate its idea of nationalism, its idea of culture and identity, so that the people going out there do not, spread a very wrong, immoral idea of England. So it's very important that public morality be maintained and the idea of culture. So what Arnold is saying is not very different from what Burke is saying. Similarly influenced, he's saying now a newly democratized England, we've done all of that, the revolution has happened and so on. There is a fear of how the English are being perceived or what they are going to, the burden, as it were, of civilization that they had given to themselves. How are they going to carry forth that burden? That debate has come up. So that has influenced criticism. And Arnold is saying that's what literature should be like. That's what, writers should aspire for, to write. What is culture, he says. What is culture? Is not putting it under an anthropological gaze, but to say culture is all that is beautiful, all that is good, that is the best. That is his very words, the best that has been ever thought and known, right? So the consolidation of the idea of culture, no, quite naturally, he's attacked with elitism because he's moved again back from the democratic idea that we saw in the previous age, now talking about creating a culture by those who know. And this idea of what is the best, again, already leaning into some very dangerous grounds there. Culture in anarchy, disturbingly, I would say, or problematically, hierarchizes society into barbarians and Philistines and populists. Right. And Arnold says that Philistines, who are now the ones who have money, for whom religion no longer matters, because we're talking about a newly emerging capitalist England, emergingly colonizing England. Religion does not matter. This is the age of doubt. Remember, Victorian England. We need to create culture in a way, in lieu, I think that's what Arnold is arguing for, in lieu of religion, right? Something to hold people down, as it were, to give them weightage, to create English society as a moral society, right? That's what culture and anarchy is all about, because without culture, Arnold is arguing there will be anarchy. What is anarchy he is speaking of, I will leave you to think about. Culture is the most resolute enemy of anarchy, because that's what he's arguing. Culture stops anarchy. But why is there the fear of anarchy? Some of the reasons I've already delineated. Culture is the most resolute enemy of anarchy because of the great hopes and designs for the state which culture teaches us to nourish. Now, culture seeks to do away with classes, says Arnold, but he's already given us a breakup of classes, you see, but it's a different kind of class. It is no more monetary class, obviously, because now with the democratized England, anyone can have money and so on, but he's seeking to create another kind of class using culture, but he doesn't say so here. Culture seeks to do away with classes to make the best that has been taught and known in the world current everywhere, to make all men live in an atmosphere of sweetness and light. This is something that occurs with Arnold again and again. He was somebody who believed, in a way, not in the neoclassical values, but in returning to Grecian society. He was a Hellenist, so he propagated Hellenism, and he thought Hellenic culture, Greek culture, had sweetness and light, and that is what we need to bring back, in a way, and celebrate. He also was somebody who believed in consolidating the idea of the state, so an authoritarian figure. If we think about Foucault and discipline and punish and so on, which is going to start here in the 19th century and so on, you can see how Arnold's ideas fit in very beautifully there, moving away from the democratic freedom, equality, liberty ideas to the state as the authority figure, and the idea of culture. That's what the literary critic should go for, which in a way reflects the glory of the state, and the state becomes the repository of all that is good, all that is valuable, and so on, right? And now I want to quickly read out the names of some of the critics who also were writing at the time. These were the female critics: Maria Jane Jewsbury, wonderful figures, really all of them, we don't have time, but Sarah Coleridge, Hannah Lawrence, Julia Kavanaugh, Mary Augusta Ward, all Victorian critics. And the very important thing is the female critics were also writing very different from the male critics. So that's something also to look at excessively. And I will return to the original before I end. So when we talk about erasure of female and women critics from Romantic and Victorian criticism, this is a figure that I urge many of you to return to: Joanna Baillie. 1762 to 1851, Introductory Discourse is a powerful prelude to Wordsworth's preface, which is seen as the manifesto of Romantic criticism. So if this is a prelude, then we're talking about somebody who deeply influenced what Wordsworth ultimately, formally put together and then, of course, became canonized, right? So she needs to take her rightful place back in the canon, as it were. She was a poet and dramatist, right? The Introductory Discourse comes before her works of drama. She wrote, I think, over 57 plays and was hugely successful. She, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, and we're going right back to the beginning of the Romantic age now, defended real passion, human feeling, and sympathetic curiosity in several of her works, right? A very, very exciting figure. She also defended, in a way, seeing nature as opposed to the state and culture, seeing nature as the repository of a lot of inspiration, of imagination for poets and so on. In fact, what I want to actually end with, this is my final, I'll just stop sharing. This is my final slide. And what I want to actually end with is the idea of education, which I think is not given enough importance when we speak about Romantic criticism and Victorian criticism. Coleridge gives an excellent kind of, idea of rethinking education if you read Biographia Literaria. And he talks about how the system of punishment, and Foucault, again, I'm reminded of, who will speak about how the 18th and 19th century began this with the prisons and the schools and so on. Coleridge is talking about this already. So we need voices like this to think about our education system also, where he says, this constant exercises and the rigmarole of the classrooms, non-creative education, forcing students to learn neoclassical values and so on, takes away and breaks the artist completely. So what he says, and he gives you his biographical details, as it were, where later in life he went back to nature. He took a break, and in going back to nature in a way, and I can very much relate to this as a poet and as an educator, in going back to nature in a way, he found his inspiration for both his political ideas, his critical ideas, and his poetry. And that's where he says his notion of fancy, as it were, developed. The other very important thing that both Wordsworth and Coleridge speak of, and again Bailey's work also has it, this importance of passion and emotions. They're making a claim at that point, and this is again very important when we look at our educational systems today. They're making a claim for literature and humanities, right? And the importance of that in society. So Coleridge, to return to him, says that the sciences are important, yes, but literature is extremely as important. And what Wordsworth also says is that not just as important, more important, because they have given us, right? Thank you. They have given us the ability to look into humanity. Right? While science gives us the ability to look at only the human body and how to, and both Wordsworth and Coleridge and other critics, of course, look at the importance of science in society, but they say that it's humanness, right? That's what literature, science does not, they say, give us any ability to understand humanity, human interconnectedness, and humanness, right? This they make a claim for. Literary critics, as literary critics, this is the role of poetics and this is the role of literature. That's what the Romantic critics are saying. And finally, just so that we don't forget, when we come to the Victorian age, one of the other prongs is the art for art's sake movement. We have come all the way from looking at art as important and critical and deeply influenced by political and social thought to, it started in France. You can see this is also, a reaction to the French Revolution in France, to say that no, art must not be, and this is also a reaction to a lot of the Marxist call at that time that was taking place to use art as social reform, right? To say that no, art must be freed from social reform and so on, and should not, in a way, be attached to any kind of social or political, idea. We know that Oscar Wilde was a proponent of this, and what is interesting is also a lot of people who propagated art for art's sake. It was a bohemian kind of, it had its own reason for being there. It was a reaction, but it was also coming from a space of privilege, right? So with that, I'm going to end my session. I see that some of you have raised your hands, so I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being such wonderful listeners. I think somebody had raised. Yes, please.
Madam, it was a fantastic speech, madam, presentation.
Thank
It
you so much.
was very nice. We got a lot of information about Romantic and about Coleridge criticism. It was really fantastic. I have noted down a lot of points, madam.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
very, very, very useful, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Welcome, ma'am. Welcome.
Sheetal, I think Sheetal Vegada, you have a question, please. Thank you. Sheetal, can you hear me? I don't know.
Yes, madam. Tennis, excellent performance, madam.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There was a lot more that I actually wanted to pack in, but there is so much what we can do in an hour. So I'm so glad to hear that you got so much out of it, because these are such exciting times. And I did want to mention that in the Victorian criticism, what Leela Gandhi's book, which is called Affective Communities, please do take a look at it. She looks at Edward Carpenter and some of these other critics, who were also influenced by Indian writers and others, and how we have not included them when we look at simply Carlyle, Ruskin, and so on. It's very important for us to decolonize, I think, the canon. Yes, please. Yes, absolutely. Devanshi, to answer your question, influence of Greek in English literature. So yes, it goes back, I think, to the Renaissance particularly. That's the beginning of this idea of consolidating. If I remember correctly, Vasari, an Italian writer of the lives of men particularly, Vasari creates this lineage, a direct lineage, as it were, from Greece and the Roman period to present day Europe, and then of course later in the 16th and 17th century this comes down to England, right? So there is an active consolidation and creation of lineages from England that go back to Greece and Roman ages. This is not to say that such a lineage actually exists naturally, but it was a configuration and a construction, and this was done for obviously nationalist purposes, particularly beginning with the Renaissance and continued on to, as I said, the 16th and 17th century during the Restoration, and was revived in the Victorian age by those like Arnold, precisely again when the nation felt as though it was losing its hold over itself, and it needed to create a certain identity that would be established in past glory, and that glory itself is a configuration. Let's not forget, if you read Edward Said's Orientalism, Said critiques colonialism all the way back to ancient Greece, to say that there were texts in ancient Greece already that looked at the heathen in a particular, the Orientalist, or the idea of the Oriental started there. So it's a configuration, and hence the influence of Greek and Latin, or Greece on English literature, and so many trajectories there, honestly. Please, Rachna.
Ma'am, very fluent and very enriching.
Thank you so much, Rachna.
I really feel that, I'm lucky to attend the session.
I'm so happy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I shall do that. Yes, I will share the PPT. I'm not a PPT person, but I just create some for online sessions like this. I prefer to simply talk, but I will definitely share it right away. I think we're running over time now, but if somebody else has a question, I would be happy to answer. Vasanti, is this the end of the session, or do we have a little more time?
Yes, ma'am. We shall move to the end of session, ma'am.
Okay. So please.
Thank you, our esteemed resource person, Dr. Sonali Pattnaik, ma'am, for sharing your vast knowledge and expertise with us today. Thank you so much, ma'am. We also extend our gratitude to all the participants for active participation. Thank you so much. Let's meet on another good session, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Thank you so much.